So teachings by default have to describe something, whatever their objective is, whatever they're trying to bring about. And all teachings are bringing about something, even if they say there's nowhere to go and there's nothing to gain and there's no change that a teaching can bring about. The reason that that's being said is because there's an understanding that saying that can bring about a change. And that includes saying that there is no change that a teaching can bring about. And so, for example, that change that's saying that the change that is known, that is possible to happen, is a change where our thinking that is so convinced that things happen the way that we think they happen, based on our idea of how things happen. And by the most part, we become convinced as we develop through life that life happens because of something that has happened before. And we don't really understand that deeply and fully, because if we understood it's because of something that happened before, we'd realize that there's always a before and a before and a before. And so the way that we develop is we start looking at things as quite isolated events. So when something goes wrong, we tend to look back one or two steps and say it started here, whereas actually it didn't really start there. That was just a continuation of something much bigger. So the way that our intellect has locked in place how life works is quite limited and lacking vision, lacking clarity. And one of the boosts that can create more freedom, create more space, create a different knowing of oneself, create a different knowing of life, is to actually undo some of the errors that have been put in place. And that can include undoing the idea that life happens the way that we have concluded that it happens. And an effective undoing of that belief is the concept that says life doesn't happen because of cause and effect. So a teaching can't be the cause of someone's waking up. So stop thinking that it can. Because if we keep thinking that way, what we're doing is reinforcing our idea of life. And so a teaching that says a teaching can't bring about someone's awakening is actually bringing about change in the way we think. But it does it in a way that doesn't appear like it's what brings about change, because it in itself says, I'm just talking because that's what's happening. No reason, no intention. And in fact, if change happens, it's not because of anything I say. So I'm not saying that that's what I say, but that is a very valid teaching approach. So whatever the teaching approach, it needs to convey an idea, a concept, because it's understood by that teaching, that is going to bring about a change that is useful. Useful relative to relative to peace of mind in daily living. Or a particular teaching will say relative to whatever that teaching has as their core. So maybe it's awakening to the formless essence of what you are. that might be the objective of that teaching, even though it says there is no objective. So the teaching will say there is no objective for the same reason, because it understands that the thinking has formed a certain way, has formed a certain idea of life. And not only does it think that life unfolds a certain way, it also thinks that getting something is very important. Now, so all of this was just said because I started off talking about how a teaching has to put forward a concept. And how we hear that concept, how we hear the words is often not how it's intended or what is meant. We'll form our own idea about what's meant by the way we interpret the words and string the sentence together, or interpret the concept, which is, a sentence. And as things start to, over time, click, and our idea of maybe a concept changes, and we start to see and feel it, and as we feel it, we can start to get a sense, oh, that is what that concept means, not what I thought. But we start to get a feel for what it really means. And as we get that feel, automatically we readjust, our working mind readjusts and says, oh, now I'm going to hear that differently. When I hear that, I'll stop hearing it as I always thought it was. And so that's just a natural progression of listening to something many times, and hopefully one of those times is said, something slightly different. Let's say an example is given, and in conjunction with everything that was heard before and how it was locked away, a shift, an aha moment happens. Why am I saying this? I'm saying this because, one, I think it's good to describe dynamics so that we have an understanding of these dynamics, and hopefully you can get a sense in what I'm saying, that this is not really something you do. You are being exposed to the teaching, and one fine day, a particular concept or a particular topic is addressed maybe slightly differently, and it opens something up. And you weren't in control of the way it was described differently, and you weren't in control of whether it being described slightly differently is going to have that opening up effect. And we might think, oh, I did the opening up, as in the person listening. It was just good luck, basically. And if it doesn't open something up, then you could say it's bad luck. But really, it's a happening. Life is a happening. And the reason I'm harboring on this point is because this notion of coming to know yourself is a concept that is put forward in a teaching, and we might not really have a clear idea of what that means. We'll have our idea of what coming to know myself. Teachings might say we have forgotten ourselves. We are disconnected from ourselves. And realization is coming to know yourself more truly, or to realize the self. And we might interpret that and say, oh, I have to know myself, and just the word know might be assumed to mean knowledge. Knowledge means information. Information is on the realm of thinking. And so we might just assume that to know oneself means that if I think about myself enough, then I will know myself. And that's just an example of a concept that can be misinterpreted. So I would say that coming to know yourself is really about an unraveling of the identity, which is basically a way of interpreting life, and an identity that is highly linked to thought, weakening and unraveling. And as it unravels, there is a different experience of life. we might find that at a time when we couldn't sit still, feeling uncomfortable, feeling like I had to achieve something and I'm not doing enough now, and there's a general restlessness, let's say, or sense of guilt that I'm wasting life, that is a set of feelings that would be very common if the false sense of self is in place. And as it unravels, as it starts to change, we might find ourselves sitting and appreciating life just for what it is in the moment, without it being about objectives and outcomes. And it's in that moment that we could say, oh, I know myself. And what that is really pointing at is, oh, I experience myself in life differently. I see that I move in life differently. And that's by default of having come to rest, you could say, or know oneself, which really just means the unraveling of the thought-based idea of oneself, the identity, which feels very, very solid and concrete. So when I say a thought-based idea, in experience, it's not going to feel at all like a thought-based idea. In experience, it's the body, mind, organism is presenting in life or is in life doing whatever they're doing, and then someone puts forward a critical comment towards you. And the experience will be one of, let's say, rage arising, or embarrassment, or despair because, let's say, someone you admire says something that is the opposite of what you'd like to hear from that person about you. And so the feeling can be one of despair that doesn't feel like it's got anything to do with a thought or a thought-based identity. It feels like you have very concretely been diminished, and that you are less than you were before that statement was made. As we start to see that identity more and more, we'll start to see that even though it feels very concrete, it is something that changes. And so in the satsangs, what I hope to do from time to time is hit on nuances that we just can't see. And there are nuance that ties in very well, keys into a gap in between, into the gap that might exist in a topic that you're been contemplating, and opens it up, cracks it open for something that was unseen, and that which is unseen is usually the dynamic of this psychological identity, cracks it open for it to be seen. So today, I want to talk about doing what you feel like. Not necessarily in the way that I normally would, but focusing on a couple of nuances. Remember, the talks are always about happiness for the human being in this life. Happiness is something very specific as defined in this teaching. Happiness is not some sort of feeling of excitement or joy or pleasure for getting something. That's pleasure. Very nice. No reason to push it away when it comes to you in life, but know it as pleasure. Know it for what it really is, something to be enjoyed, something that feels much better than pain. I'll take as much of it as life is willing to give. However, the tragedy is when we think that pleasure is something more than it actually is. And we tend to do that very successfully through life, think that pleasure is something more than what it is, and invest or believe that pleasure will give me something much more than it actually can. i.e., we are looking for long-term happiness in outcomes which are only pleasure. So that's not the happiness that we're speaking. Happiness, as defined in this teaching, is happiness through peace of mind. And peace of mind is the end of suffering. And suffering is what that psychological identity turns into many times during the day. Doing what we feel like doing and realizing how we don't do that a lot of the time during the day is bringing our attention onto the very practical and existing aspects of our life, because it's very easy to get interested in spiritual teaching and know the concepts, which are often generic concepts, which means they will apply to a broad range of, or to everyone, let's say, but for everyone, they will have a very specific manifestation. So guilt is one form of suffering, and there would be many things that people would feel guilty about. Different people would feel guilty about different things. And so when we talk about guilt as a generic description, it's very easy for the intellect to conceptualize guilt and to never look on the level of one's own experience and see the guilt that is your specific guilt. So this movement into doing what we feel like is bringing our attention onto something in daily living. And often, as I just mentioned, our seeking can become disconnected from daily living. And so we think about a whole lot of concepts and don't see how they relate. We don't necessarily see the implications of a certain concept. So our happiness, peace of mind, is not to be found in outcomes. Outcomes are either pleasure or pain. They're part of the unfolding circumstance. We might know that intellectually because we've heard it a lot. My happiness isn't to be found in outcomes. When our attention lands on our obsession, our addiction with trying to control and manipulate circumstance, control and manipulate ourselves, control and manipulate the other in order to get outcomes, that's when we may have an aha moment about how deeply ingrained and how existence this attachment to outcomes is. How even though we've heard it 1,000 times, possibly, your happiness isn't to be found in outcomes. Your happiness isn't to be found in the future. Your happiness isn't to be found in what the other does or doesn't do. Your happiness isn't to be found in pleasure or pain. They're all the same way of saying your happiness is not to be found in circumstance, not to be found in the way life unfolds. There's a great freedom if we really believe this. If not even believe it, if we come to see how true it is, then that obsession, that addiction falls away. And when that addiction falls away, a whole set of efforts and in particular thinking about life fall away and change. So if we keep reinforcing by doing, and I don't mean doing as the doer, but simply by functioning a particular way, if we keep functioning in a way that we're trying to control the other, what the behavior is saying is, I believe my happiness is to be found in the other being a certain way and doing certain things. And yet, intellectually, we might say, my happiness isn't to be found in outcomes. And we might think we really get it. And yet, the body is moving in such a way that is trying to manipulate the other or manipulate our own behaviors. And why? Because we're convinced deep down that that is very important. if this isn't seen as being a form of attachment to outcome, because we might have this idea, this is the way our thinking works, that, oh, attachment to outcomes means that if I'm invested in a new car being where my happiness is, then I'm mistaken, because we say, okay, new car is an outcome and it's pleasurable. And we might say, oh, I don't do that. I know that's wrong. But then we might miss the fact that my insistence on someone being a certain way, or myself being a certain way, in order to please someone else, or in order for the other to please me, is exactly the same principle, attachment to outcomes.